The People of 1381 project is focused on revealing new insights into the diverse range of people who played a part in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and will give us more detail into the lives of ordinary people in the later Middle Ages. Which people and social groups were involved in England's biggest pre-Civil War revolt, and how much can we find out about their lives? Where did they come from? What actions were they accused of in the revolt? What happened in their trials, and what did life have in store for them in the years that followed? The project also includes a teacher fellowship programme being run in partnership with the EHA, and that's currently underway, and has allowed participants to access a brand new database being constructed, so all very exciting. It's a multi-institution project led by Professor Adrian Bell and Dr. Herbert Iden from the University of Reading, Professor Anne Curry from the University of Southampton, Professor Andrew Prescott from the University of Glasgow, and Doctors Helen, Lacey and Dr. Helen Killick from the University of Oxford. And I'm delighted to introduce three of those people to you here this afternoon. So welcome Professor Adrian Bell, Dr. Helen Lacey and Dr. Helen Killick, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mel. So I'm Dr. Helen Killick, and I'm going to start by just introducing you to our database and talking a bit about some of the things, the sort of overall findings that we've managed to produce so far. We spent the last 2.5 years constructing this database, which is now publicly available and searchable online. And our original aims were to try and capture as much information as possible about the people, places, and events of 1381 based on the legal sources, primarily the records of prosecutions of rebels in the aftermath of the revolt, but also other types of legal record. One of the key challenges that we faced was how to accommodate such a wide variety of material within a single database structure. I think I'm right in saying that most other comparable projects have focused on a single type of source. So if any of you are familiar with projects such as that on the Inquisition's post-mortem, the England's Immigrants Project, which looked at the alien subsidies, or the Medieval Soldier Database, which looked at master rolls, they all focused on a single source. And by contrast, our database includes various different types of legal action, in addition to records such as escheator accounts, petitions, pardons, manorial records, and various others. So we've set ourselves quite a task. Helen, if you could move on to the next slide, thank you. As I said, the database is now publicly available and searchable hopefully you can see the URL displayed there. Just to note that we're still inputting data, and also the search facility itself is still under construction. So if you've got if you play around with it, and if you see any issues or if you've got any comments, then please do get in touch with us, and there's a contact form on the website. So there are several ways you can search the database. If you're interested in a specific person or place, you can browse alphabetical lists of names and of locations, each linked to take you to the relevant record. And if you're searching for anything else, such as a specific occupation or a kind of feature of the uprising, you can use the keyword search. And you can make this more focused by limiting it to either the people or events tables in the database, or you can just search everything and see what turns up. And there's also a mapping tool, which you can see a picture of on the right here. So all locations are given coordinates so that they can be mapped, and this allows us to build up a picture of an individual's movements during the revolt. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to date, we've entered into the database over 600 sources, which between them contain information on over 1,500 incidents in the revolt. We've got over 16,000 person entries, and accounting for multiple occurrences of the same person in different records, this is approximately over 13,000 individuals. So an interesting fact is that only 208 of these relate to women. So this is perhaps surprising in light of recent scholarship, which has emphasized the importance of women in 1381. So I'll come back to talk about this more in a moment. So in terms of the records themselves, in many cases, all we have is the person's name. usually just first name and surname. Sometimes they're described in relation to other people, so, you know, son of so-and-so. And when we do have further information in this period, it's usually where the person was from. So in roughly half the records, we've got a place name or, you know, domicile associated with that person. Only 16% of the records describe what the person did for a living. And I worked on another project previously, which looked at property transactions between 1300 and 1500. And what I found on that was that information on jobs tended to be more frequently used as a means of identification as time went on. So effectively taking the place of geographical information, perhaps due to an increasingly mobile population. Next slide, please. So we've got over 100 different occupations mentioned. This reflects the increasing division of labour in the century after the Black Death. And this is just a random sample, but as you can see, we have quite specialised occupations like children's shoemaker and mattress maker. We need to take into account the fact that occupational information was not recorded randomly. So it's more likely to be given for those of higher status and those from certain social groups, for example, the clergy, so we've got monk and chaplain in this example, or townsmen who are often merchants and craftsmen. So here we've got examples like armourer, goldsmith and glover. So it's quite tricky to make assumptions about the social makeup of the rebels and their victims just on the basis of the legal record alone. And this is where we need to track people in other sources to build up a more accurate picture. Next slide, please. So first to say that this is a very rough picture. And as we've tried to accommodate such a wide variety of material, the nature of an incident in the revolt kind of varies substantially. So some counties are likely to be underrepresented as well, Hertfordshire and Cambridgeshire, for example, because we focused on our key counties of Essex, Kent and Norfolk. So in some ways, this map illustrates our progress in data collection rather than actual level of activity. But with these caveats, there are a few observations we can make. For instance, the high number of events in Norfolk challenges the prevailing orthodoxy about Kent and Essex being the most turbulent areas in the revolt. And the data also shows high activity in parts of the country which have not until now generally been considered key areas, most notably Yorkshire, where the revolt centred around the towns of Beverley, York and Scarborough. Another important point to make regarding this map is that in some ways it shows the limitations of our data in focusing on the legal sources and the number of prosecutions. So to some extent, it therefore reflects the geographical pattern of the government's response to the revolt rather than actual levels of participation. And we can illustrate this through comparison with another map, if we can have the next slide, which this shows the geographical spread of people who applied for and received a pardon under the terms of the general amnesty in November 1381. So we should note that inclusion in the pardon roll can't by itself be used as firm evidence that person took part in the uprising as a rebel. And this is because there's evidence that false accusations were common and people sometimes took advantage of the revolt to sort of settle scores. So someone might therefore have taken out a pardon as a precautionary measure. However, it does give some indication of likelihood of involvement. And the obvious contrast with the previous map is that the geographical spread, as you can see, is much wider. All but two counties are represented. And in the case of one of these, Lancashire, the reason is likely to be administrative due to its status as a county palatine with a different system of record keeping. A significant number of people receiving a pardon also came from the far north, the Midlands and the west of the country, regions which are otherwise largely unrepresented in our data. What the two maps have in common is that they show the greatest level of activity in those counties on the east coast. This largely confirms previous research on the revolt, but it's interesting to see it quantified in this way. And it also appears that the level of activity in Yorkshire has until now been underestimated. Next slide, please. Thank you. So finally, just to say something about women in the revolt, and this has been a bit of a hot topic in recent years, with some historians keen to emphasize that women played an active role. And the example perhaps most frequently mentioned is that of Joanna Ferrer, who was the leader of the group of rebels who executed Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Joanna even made it onto Horrible Histories, which is where the picture on the left is from. And she's, kind of mentioned in the same in kind of same breath as Emmeline Pankhurst, Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman as examples of women who changed the world on this programme. And the idea of female rebels seems to have become firmly embedded in the public consciousness, and our recent article in BBC History magazine received some criticism for apparently leaving women out of the story, although in our defence, our article was focusing on the military background of rebels, so this wasn't really the topic that we were focusing on. If we could look at the next slide. Thank you. So when you look at our data, it paints quite a different picture of the role of women in 1381. And so, as I said earlier, out of over 16,000 entries, only 208 relate to women, which is roughly 1.3%. And furthermore, if we look at the roles that women were playing in the legal cases, we find a minority who are actually accused of committing crimes during the revolt, 11%, the blue segment there, in contrast to almost half of male participants. And almost a third of female entries in our database are in fact victims, in contrast to only 10% of men. Otherwise, women occur in more ambiguous contexts, such as mentioned as relatives of the accused or victim. We do find a significant proportion of women who are pardoned. However, as I mentioned earlier, this can't by itself be taken as firm evidence that they took part in the uprising as a rebel. However, the work of Silvia Federico has argued that the presence of, the significant number of women on the pardon roll suggests what she terms a horizon of plausibility for female participation in the revolt. So she argues that even if we don't know what, if any, crimes they committed, and even if it was motivated by a fear of false accusation, the fact that they were obtaining a pardon necessary is significant, as it indicates that their participation was plausible. On this topic, we should also, again, acknowledge the limitations of our sources and what the records don't tell us. So women in this period, for the most part, didn't have independent legal status, and they were therefore less likely to be prosecuted. Their involvement, therefore, could be hidden from us. For example, in cases where a husband and wife acted together, the husband may have been the only one prosecuted. So perhaps in this view, women like Joanna Farrer, we can see as the tip of the iceberg, but this is still very much up for debate. And now I'm going to hand over to Helen Lacey, who's going to take a more in-depth look at some of our sources.
Thanks, Helen. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I want to change tack a bit and talk about some of the work that I've been doing on trying to investigate the voices of the people of 1381. And by voices, I mean those sort of snippets of reported speech or comments that people had made that have then made their way through into the legal records. And obviously one of the challenges, if you like, to the project is that the majority of the material we're using are legal records that are written up in a dry, quite formalistic way in the Latin of the court records of the day. So to sort of penetrate that, if you like, and to get through to some of the words that might have been spoken by the people who participated in the rising is quite a challenge. But I've got a few instances to show you now that help us to sort of find ways around that difficulty. So the first one is that you can see on your slide is a bit of an excerpt from the interrogation of a known rebel, a man called John Preston of Hadley, and he came before the commissioners in Chelmsford in Essex shortly after the rising. So these are people who are now being brought before the courts, they're being accused of participation in the rebellion, and they might ultimately be sentenced to death for treason for having taken part. But this case is really unusual because what happens with John Preston is that he comes before the commissioners and he actually hands them a piece of parchment, and this is what's written on it, which is on your screens now. So he says that he's petitioning the justices of the bench, the judicial commissioners, to sort of hear his case, if you like. And this is the script on the screen is him saying that he, on behalf of the Commons, requests of the king that no one should pay more than a standard rate of 4p an acre for land. So they want a standard, set a standard rent of land. He also requests that no court should be held in any village except for one kind of court per year. And furthermore, they request that if any thief or traitor against the peace is captured in a village, then the king should give them a particular law by which that traitor should be punished. So this is really unusual. That it shows for a start that he's literate, he's writing, he says under interrogation that he wrote this himself with his own hand. So he's confessing that he wrote this up and he handed it to the king's justices. He's not, interestingly, confessing to actually having taken part in the rebellion or having killed anyone or having taken any other kind of illegal action. This is his only action that we know of, that handing in this petition. But on this basis alone, the commissioners find him guilty of treason. Saying these words that you see on the screen or writing them down is enough to have him sentenced to death. And he's taken away to be hanged for this act of committing to paper some of the demands that are the same demands as the rebels had made in those famous meetings in London at Mile End and at Smithfield. Another case that's interesting is that of John Shirl of Nottingham. This was a man who had travelled to Cambridge just at the time of the revolt and shortly afterwards. And what happened in his case was that he was overheard in a tavern. And this is something that is quite familiar from other medieval trials, where people are actually overheard having said things that they shouldn't have in pubs and taverns, and then they're reported on, their speeches actually reported to the justices. So here in this tavern in Bread Street in Cambridge, John Shirley is accused of being overheard saying that he's in praise of John Ball, who is this renegade preacher during the revolt itself. John Ball famously said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" So John Shirley is overheard praising him and saying that he's an upright and upworthy man, and that he should be in charge of the country rather than the king and the magnates around him. And in fact, the king and the magnates are more worthy of death than the death that was handed out to John Ball. And so then John Shirley is arrested and brought to trial for these words. In some other cases, we have just glimpses and glimmers of the words that they spoke. And this man, John Buck of Ely, is interesting because in his trial, he was interrogated and questioned as to why he took part in the rising. And the only sort of excerpt we've got of his language is that he said he joined the revolt because of the devil, by command of the devil. And this is an interesting, to ponder why he might have said this. Either he's getting sort of irritated at the justices and, trying to dismiss them and saying, well, I did it because the devil told me to, hang you all kind of thing. Or he's saying it in a quite sincere way and actually saying that it's because of sort of divine intervention or diabolic intervention in this case, that he was pushed forward and made to take part in the revolt. And it wasn't his fault because he was driven by these unearthly forces to take part in the rising. In other cases like this one, Thomas Atsol of Gravesend, we get quite an interesting wordplay in his confession. So he confesses that he was within the chamber of the Tower of London. This is the most sort of intimate, most private rooms of the Tower of London. And him and other rebels break into the king's bedchamber. And he says in his confession that he split the bed of the king with his sword. And here there's an interesting wordplay between seducer and splitting the bed, and sedition and sort of treason that accompanies that. So the record is sort of him conjuring up this word of seducer and sedition. Sometimes in the records, we also get prisoners confessing to having taken part whilst they're in prison. And they do this because of this system in medieval law called, it's called a medieval approver's appeal, but you might be more familiar with it as the term of turning king's evidence. So this is where someone can confess to their own part in this case in the rising, and name their co-conspirators. And in return, if those co-conspirators are convicted, then that person, the original person, is potentially pardoned and given mercy for their part in the rebellion. So this is a famous appeal that you can see on the screen by a known and prominent rebel leader, a man called John Raw of Suffolk. And Raw had led bands of rebels through the countryside. And it's a really long record of his confession. And a lot of it's quite sort of standard, actually, quite plodding in its rhythm of taking us through his journey through Suffolk and the sort of the houses that he attacked and so on. It does have glimmers, though, of his personality or things that he's trying to do in his speech. So in one instance, he says that they broke into a tavern and they sequestered all of the beer and the wine for the rebel band, and they drank it all and so on. But then he says at the end of it that he made a point of paying the innkeeper for the goods that they requisitioned from him, because it was this sort of like honor among thieves mentality, that he would make sure that he would pay the innkeeper for the goods and wine and beer and so on that they'd taken. This appeal that you can see on the screen now is an interesting one, because this is a man from Oxfordshire who is confessing to quite an outlandish plot. And you know, when you read it and you skim your eye over it, you'll see that this is perhaps far-fetched, and we can speculate as to the reasons why that he's confessing to such an outlandish plot. And it might be the case that actually in this instance, what we have is someone who's trying desperately to catch the eye of the justices so that they will save his life, because they're so sort of concerned or intrigued about the confession that he's making. The background to Robert Bennet's life is important here, in the sense that Robert Bennet had been arrested some years previously and was actually in prison at the time of the rebellion. So when the rebels sweep through London in those days, in the summer of June 1381, our man Robert Bennet is actually in prison in Southwark awaiting trial. He's been arrested previously several times actually for different misdemeanors, burglary and theft, and he's in prison. And then what happens is that as the rebel bands sweep through London, they open the prisons and let out the prisoners with the idea that then they'll join their force and add to the ranks of the rebels. So Robert Bennet escapes from prison and is kind of now acting as one of the rebels. But then what happens is that he's arrested by the London authorities. And actually, when they arrest him, they find in his pocket 6 silver spoons. And his story is that these silver spoons were in his pocket because they were given him as safekeeping by the wife of the prison keeper, the jail keeper, which is an interesting defense, shall we say. So Robert Bennet gives this, so he's arrested, he's put in prison, and then you know, he's potentially facing capital punishment for the most serious of offences, treason and joining the rebels. So what he's going to try and do, like the other person we saw previously, is he's trying to make an approver's appeal and turn king's evidence. But the story that he comes up with, that you can see here, is that he says him and his associates have been contacted by John de Varenne, who is a famous French admiral. So this is, you know, one of the top French admirals contacting lowly Robert Bennet of Barford St John in Oxfordshire somehow, well, through his squire, he says. And he's bribed in £100 of gold, which is a vast amount in this period. And he's bribed with this money to agree with the French admiral that they'll plot together, and that Robert Bennet and his confederates will sweep and go across the south coast of England and remove Englishmen from the south coast, which will free the way for the French to invade with their ships, invade the south coast of England, burn, kill and destroy those parts, and then potentially, presumably, take the throne of England for the French. And he finishes the confession by saying that his two co-conspirators have in their possession £100 of gold, but Robert Bennet hasn't seen anything of this money himself, so he's so annoyed that he's going to inform on them and potentially have them sentenced for treason. Now, I mean, the credibility of this story seems weak, that, you know, a French admiral would get in touch with him, that £100 in gold is such a vast amount. But it's interesting that he's playing on the fears of contemporaries, that actually around this time, the war with the French was going badly for the English, and the ideas or the fears of French invasion were really circulating in the air. So he's tapping into that, and he's saying, you know, these fears that you've got are true, and actually that the French could at any moment invade the south coast of England. This next slide involves the case of a man called John Cote of Kent, and this involves a plot that happened after the main events of June of 1381, but it definitely plays on some of those things that happened in the summer of 1381 and sort of invokes them in this new plot that they're hatching, or they're confessing to hatching in Kent in September of 1381. So what happens is the juries, first of all, the local jury comes together and accuses this man, John Cote, of conspiracy. So they bring a jury together, picked for their local knowledge, and this jury are saying that they know of a local plot that's being hatched by John Cott, William Delton, and other men. And so that what will then happen is that they will be arrested. So John Cott is arrested, and then he makes a confession whilst he's in prison, and you can see the text of the confession here. You don't need to read it all, but just to see that I've highlighted in yellow some of the interesting words that it contains. He acknowledges that he was part of a plot, and he feloniously and traitorously took part in this plot. This is, using the language of the law courts against him. And he says that him and his accomplices came together, and they were intent on plotting to enforce on the king the promises that he'd made at Mile End. If you see there in yellow, the Mile End. So that meeting that happened, excuse me, the meeting that happened in June of 1381, and the king had reneged on his promises, and now these men want to enforce the king to do good on the promises that he made at Mile End. And they said that if the king is unwilling to grant these promises, then they will destroy and annul the king and the statutes of the king himself. And in the third paragraph, you see, interestingly, he says that he heard that strangers, or perhaps pilgrims, had come out of the North Country to Canterbury, and that they were telling this story that John, Duke of Lancaster, who's the king's uncle at the time, John of Gaunt, there's a rumour that he'd made his natives free. He'd freed all his serfs from bondage and set them free. And so what these plotters are saying is that if this rumour is true, that they want to put John of Gaunt on the throne and remove the king, put John of Gaunt up as the king instead. So this is quite, radical plot to remove the king himself. And what John Cott also does is inform on some of his co-conspirators. So one of his co-conspirators, he is a man called William Delton. So they arrest Delton, bring him in. But Delton, you see here, this is Delton denying the accusations against him. And then in medieval law, what happens is Delton is given the opportunity to claim trial by battle. So what Delton will do is say that he is innocent of the charges, and that in order to prove his innocence, he will fight a duel with John Cott, his accuser, and the victor of that duel will be the one who's deemed innocent. That's what medieval law says. So a day is set for the trial by battle, and they come together at Tot Hill in London to fight this battle, and the battle is a raid between them. And John Cott beats William Delton. He's vanquished but not killed. So at this point, he is the one who's deemed to be guilty, Delton, and he's taken back to prison to await his execution. So he's now, in prison awaiting execution, and his final throw of the dice, if you like, is that he will confess himself in a bid to finally save himself from the gallows. So he now confesses to the plot as well, and he adds more detail to this plot, which John Cott has already confessed to. And he says that there was a big plot in Kent, that there were going to be 32 armed men and 60 archers coming from Romney Marsh, and that there were going to be another 18 fighting men coming with another of the conspirators, and that they were making a great congregation in a wood called La Bataille, called Depperfield, sorry, next to La Bataille, and that they would come together, and this force would potentially pursue the rebellion further. And then in the third paragraph, what you see is that he says, really interestingly, again, that what they plotted to do was to place in the court of various people, so various nobles have their own courts, and the rebels are going to put servants in these households and basically listen behind curtains and listen behind doors and see if there's any dissent amongst the nobles or amongst the nobles against the king. And if they detect any dissent, then they would throw in their lot with them to try and destroy the party of the king and to uphold the nobles that they'd discovered who were against the king. Because this is a really interesting plot involving, the servant class and listening behind doors and so on to get their way. And interesting as well that the language is extreme here. They want to overthrow the king and the kingdom. Now this might be words given to them by the court to make the plot seem as bad as possible, but also, of course, Delton is confessing at this point. So in a sense, it would be worth his while to say that this plot was so extreme and so awful. that the justices need to listen to him. And just as a final thought, it's interesting that with some of these rebels, not all of them, but some of them, we can find out what happened to them. And in Dalton's case, of course, he was still executed for his part in the plot and the rising. But what we have is an estuta record, which is a record of the officials who looked into his lands and belongings after he'd died to see how much they were worth and whether the crown wanted to take any of his money, basically. And the record shows that Dalton was not a very, very wealthy person. He leaves 18 shillings and 8 pence in goods and chattels after he's executed. And you can see here on the screen, he has a brazen pot, a brass pot worth 3 shillings. It's pretty pathetic, really. 2 brazen bowls worth 16 pence, a quarter of apples, you know, they're going to that level of detail, and other fruit worth 12 pence, a quarter of wheat, 2 pigs and some firewood. And you can see in the last paragraph at the bottom that he's survived by his wife, Juliana, who will inherit the rights to his land, which is valued at 18 pence a year. So that's the end for our man, William Dalton. And I'll hand you over now to Adrian, who's going to talk a little bit about the soldiers who participated in the rising.
Thanks, Helen. So the final bit for today, and then we can have some time for questions, is to talk about the involvement, let's say, not of soldiers as such, but of participants in the rebellion who we can find have military experience. And this is probably the start point for the project, was thinking around the highly organised way that the rebellion, especially in the march to London and the events at the Tower of London happened. It was always on my mind that somehow those responsible were military experienced. And in a previous project, we created the Soldier in Late Medieval England project, which you can see the database there, where we've got a database of people who served in the 100 Years' War between 1369 and 1453. And I'll talk a bit about the sources we used there, and then tell you about how we've started to compare the names of people with military service against those who we know took part in the rebellion. So the next slide, please, Helen. So what we used in this previous project was, as Helen Killick said earlier, was muster rolls. These are fairly easy to use for medieval historians because a list of names. This is a muster roll from 1387 of a campaign led by the Earl of Arundel. It's a naval campaign, and he's the first listed name on there. You can see it says Le Comte Mézines. The man himself doesn't even need to use his own name, followed by the Comte Mareschal, who's the Earl Marshal, and that then is the Earl of Nottingham at this time. Next slide, please, Helen. And muster rolls are very interesting because they run in terms of seniority. So you get the noble who's the retinue leader at the start, but it might be a knight or an esquire even, or even an archer sometimes, and then will follow by list of seniority. And so here we then see the bannerets are listed next. And you can see the top one there is Mons Richard Sions. So it's actually Sir Mons Monsieur, Sir Richard Sions, etc. Sir Richard Talbot. Next slide, please, Helen. And then you get the chevaliers. These are the knights, again with the Sir before their name. And unfortunately, you get, if you go halfway down in muster rolls, they record the level of the number of days people have served because they get paid per day, per diem. And this one in the middle, Sir Esmond Fitzherbert, has died on the, I think it says 28th day of April. So he's not going to get paid after that day. So quite a sad story. Dies serving for his crown, but immediately gets his wages stopped. And next slide, please. And then we have the esquires. So these are the squires. So these again fight like men at arms in full armor on horseback, obviously not on horseback on the ships in this naval campaign. And you can see the various scribblings around to note when people have been absent, but also if they've been knighted, because if they were knighted, they would also be get a higher wage per day from the day of that knighting. The interesting thing about this particular muster roll, which is quite famous, you might, how can a muster roll be famous? But in the middle, I can't show you now, but in the middle there's a Owen Glyndwdy, who is actually Owen Glyndwr future Prince of Wales, but at this point in 1387, an esquire in the Earl of Arundel's campaign. Next slide, please. And the lovely thing about the muster rolls is they go all the way through the retinue right down to the archers. These are the archers, and it says archers armes, or armed archers, and they are all listed in name. And the interesting thing here is the pointing at the left-hand side of the names. You see these people are checked 3 times, so by 2 dots, and then a squiggle that shows the names have been read 3 times. Are they present at 3 different times during this campaign again? So next slide, please. So some data, we started now comparing the database we've got of soldiers or people who've served militarily for the English crown during this period between about 1369 to around 30. We've only gone up to 1382 at the moment because we want to look at what experience they had before. Remember, the idea is they're militarily experienced. And we've managed to push that back to about 1350s with some other, we didn't do this during the original project, we've done this more recently, looking at other evidence. So there's a note of caution. This is the whole database, so we may get connections with people who are victims and also people who appear because they are, let's say, act surety for someone who is being accused of being a rebel. So there's all sorts of different participants, we call them, in the database. So we're hitting everybody at the moment. So when we look just at muster rolls for Ireland and Calais, so these are between about 1350 and 1369. So people who might have served in the garrison of Calais or on some Irish expeditions, then we get 360 hits. When we look at protections, now protections are a particular type of military source, which where someone would pay so they do not get prosecuted whilst they're on military campaign. These protections exist before 1369, and we get 159 hits from those with potential rebels or other participants. And then for our whole muster rolls and protections, the existing database we had before this project started, we have about 150 to 200 hits for this period. And it must be said that these are good numbers, I think. I think we're quite pleased to find this many numbers. You might think there's not so many, but actually this time, looking backwards between 1360 and 1381, there's not that much military things going on. There's a lull in the fight with France between 1360 to 1369, and then there's not that many activities in the intervening years. So I sense there's a lot more to come afterwards to look at, looking forward in sense, where did these participants serve in the future? So I've just said then there's about 11% exact name matches, and there's just about out of about 6,000 accused rebels in our database. And this is again looking for exact names, so exact first name and surname. And surnames are not standard during this period. The surname basically reflects what the clerk has written down is the name when they heard it. So especially with the muster roll. So essentially we can do more sophisticated looks for surname matches that are sound-alikes, which will bring up more hits once we start looking properly. A question for us, which we're thinking more of, is how much did disillusion with the conduct of war with France? It's not going particularly well at this period. And how did that influence soldiers like this joining the revolt? Okay, next slide, please, Helen. Some of the things we've found, so when we look at who these soldiers are and then link them to the database we've got around what they actually got up to during the rebellion, we find some interesting sort of typographies we could start thinking about. So this is a way we can start to analyze this data. So some, which maybe we'd expect, some of the people we find are leaders of the rising. So some leaders of the rising we can find, yes, indeed, did have military experience, sometimes multiple times. We also get extremely recent military experience, and I'll look at one of these examples in a second. So people who have been on very recent military campaign and come back and immediately begun to rebel. And I find that's quite strange, isn't it? Why would you fight for the crown on the one hand and then immediately rebel on the other? We find lots of successful attacks on property throughout the rebellion across England. And when you think about these, you read about them, you perhaps don't think too much about them, but these are really, really big buildings that are being brought down. And sometimes they describe them as being brought down to the ground. That means every single bit of the building destroyed. And we also get descriptions of military equipment being built and used. So these people who really did know what they were doing, they really could destroy buildings very effectively, and these would be brick-built building or stone-built buildings that would be destroyed, and wooden buildings obviously burned as well. We also have a lot of evidence to show us that around the coast, we do see a lot of sea captains and sailors involved, and there's been another study on that which we're able to draw upon. There's a criminality element, and there's always a connection between, I think, soldiers and criminality, which is interesting to unwind, really. But a lot of these soldiers are actually in prison, and during rebellions, what do? You generally open the prisons to create even more trouble or havoc, and we find that lots of them go on to do things that we find records in the sources, and they've been a soldier, then they're somehow in prison, and then they're released, and they go on to create, become a rebellion. And also, we find some, which we've not quite really unwound yet or looked into more deeply, is why people who have been involved in supplying forces, so logistically, are also involved too. And then in the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, there's some of you'll have seen that Bishop Dispenser, he's called, he's a very warlike bishop. He puts down part of the rising in North Walsham, a Battle of North Walsham, where we're working with the Battlefield Trust to do a sign on the battlefield. And he's very prominent in that. And yet, just a year or two later, he's on a campaign to Flanders, which is funded as a crusade, and he takes with him many rebels who he would have been prosecuting or putting down just a couple of years before. So we say that things in medieval world ran very smoothly at times, despite what side you were on. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the one I spoke about a bit earlier. So this is a guy, a chap called John Pepper. And why he's interesting, he's part of a main rebel group across Cambridgeshire, who's described as carrying a lance and a pennant. We've written a little story about him if you want to go on the website under our people and places section. And as I said, he's only arrived back in England from France. He's been on campaign for a year, and he's back on the 2nd of May 1381, and yet by the 13th of June he's attacking a justice of peace in Cambridgeshire, and then leads a mounted raid. What happens to him afterwards? He's not given an amnesty in 1381, so he's not allowed to take a pardon, what Helen spoke about. But later he is pardoned in 1383, and again pardoned in 1386. So what happens to him for his rebellion? Well, nothing. He goes on to live his life. We know he owns land. He's not a peasant. That's another thing we're thinking about. How accurate is this idea of a peasant's revolt? And he's linked with other rebels as well. We can find him linked to people he acts with in a rebellious way in other activities back to 1374, and also as far back as 1367. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please, Helen. And the final person I'll talk about is Thomas Trivett. He's quite a famous soldier, and he is a victim. So I'm not talking about him as being a rebel. I'm talking to him about being a victim. And just here, I'm just showing you from our database the length of military experience he has. He's a very, very experienced military campaigner, sometimes on his own, sometimes in groups. And quite, I think, from the descriptions, been quite a menacing individual. And during the appellant crisis of 1387, 1388, he actually leads ambushes on John of Gaunt. So he's not a person you would mess with. Despite this, if you look at the next slide, Helen, our final slide, from our database, he leads a commission. So he's one of the leaders of the group of people who go around to quell the revolt in Kent. And he comes up against a group of people who actually kidnapped him during the revolt and made him swear allegiance to them during that revolt. Now, I find that's quite interesting. He's actually a judge judging something that happened to himself, whilst he also looks at other things that happen in Kent. So we have to question this evidence a bit. Nevertheless, there it is. And the people involved in this capture of Thomas, he may well have known them, because we know through looking at the soldier database that they intersected on a couple of campaigns through the 1370s. And for me, it's interesting just to show us that the rebels were very, since they knew what they were doing. They were able to capture here a prominent knight, a knight who would have had, I'm assuming, followers, bodyguards, people with him when he was taken, and yet they were able to take him. They overpowered him in whatever way, or he just realized the day was not for fighting that day, and he would get his own back later. But even someone like Thomas Trivett was, awed by the rebels or the might of the rebels, which then gives us to think that actually they did know what they're doing and probably were military active, as I can show, or as we can show by these particular ones who took him there. And I think, and that's it today.